Chapter 7. Prophecies and Patterns. Yenna arrived at Redder House with her 2 hounds and the careful reserve of someone who has learned not to expect welcome from people who owe her nothing. She stayed for the entire week between trials, and by the 3rd day, she had stopped expecting to be asked to leave. The warmth surprised her most. Not the fire, though the hearths were well kept and generous, but the way the family moved around each other, with the easy disorder of people who have stopped pretending to be formal. Sienna explained the wind to Caspian with the seriousness of a scholar. Riffa sharpened knives in the armoury, while Rhianna told stories that made even Lord Redder laugh. Marius worked through correspondence at the kitchen table because, he said, the study was too quiet and made him suspicious of his own thoughts. Lady Lyanna fed her without fuss, adding a place at the table as if Yenna had always been there. Alaris asked her about the deep north with the genuine interest of someone who had once studied maps and still remembered that places were made of people, not just borders. Elisa watched her with the attention dragons reserve for puzzles they have decided are worth solving. The days fell into a rhythm. Mornings were spent in the stables, where Yenna's hounds appointed themselves guardians of the grumpy horse and succeeded where Sienna's wind had failed. Afternoons brought long walks through spring gardens, conversations that wandered from grain yields to the best way to train a dog, and the kind of silences that meant comfort rather than awkwardness. Evenings gathered everyone to the table, where stories were told in the piecemeal way families tell them, interrupting each other, correcting details, laughing at old mistakes that had stopped being painful and become fond. Over those dinners, Yenna learned their stories. She learned about the nest, the 3 youths who had travelled together, the dragon Severin who had been wild and was now loved, the blue called Rishan, who still flinched at kindness. She learned about Riffa's eastern father who had recognised her by a locket, and his own jaw on another, about Marius's weather tower and his fair taxes, about Rhaenna's gold wings and her habit of being right in ways that were inconvenient for everyone. She learned that Auntie had once promised to marry Riffa, that Marius had been taken by the lady on a pale blue dragon and rescued by his knight in shining armour, that all 3 of them had left the nest together with nothing but their skills and their friendship and made themselves into the people they needed to be. Rife showed her the practice yard and offered to spar. Yenna, who had learned to fight in the deep north where winter made you practical or dead, accepted. They traded bruises and respect in equal measure, and when it was done, Riffa handed her a water skin and said, "You are good enough to survive as king. You have patience." "Patience," Yenna said, "is what you learn when your mistakes can kill you." "Yes," Riff agreed, "it is." It was, Yenna thought, a better education than any trial could provide. Only the 2 dragons eyed her thoughtfully. She caught them whispering more than once, heads bent together near the stable, on the terrace where the cold did not bother them, by the fire when they thought she had gone to bed. Not hostile, just curious. The way one examines a piece of embroidery and tries to identify a stitch that does not belong to any pattern you recognise. On the 6th evening, just before Yenna was to leave for the 2nd trial, Elisa could contain herself no longer. They were in the sitting room, Yenna, Eliza, Rhaenna, Rife, and Lady Lyanna. The men had taken themselves off to argue about horses, and Sienna had dragged Caspian to the kitchen to investigate whether bread could be convinced to rise faster with the proper application of wind. Elisa set down her cup with the deliberate care of someone who has decided to ask a question that might be rude, but needs asking anyway. "Have you," she said, looking at Yenna directly, "ever met the Oracle?" Yenna blinked. Of all the questions she had expected, that was not among them. "Yes," she said slowly. "When I was 10. She came to our home in the deep north. My mother nearly fainted. We are not accustomed to prophecies that far from the capital." "What did she say?" Rhaenna asked, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who recognises the shape of fate when it walks into a room. Yenna hesitated. Prophecies were private things, fragile and dangerous. But these women had shared their own stories without hedging, and she found she trusted them in a way that surprised her. She said, Yenna began carefully, that one day I would have a choice to make between the crown and sky, that it was also a choice between heart and power. She paused, then added, and that I was to choose carefully, for my choice would shape the future of all 4 kingdoms, as well as my own life. Elisa and Raina looked at each other. The glance was brief, weighted, and spoke in the silent language mothers and daughters develop when they are also both dragons. The blue, Raina said softly. Soon, Elisa agreed. Yenna frowned. What blue? But they only smiled, small, knowing and entirely infuriating. You will understand when you meet him, Elisa said. Prophecies, Raina added, with the weariness of someone who has lived under one, have a habit of being clearer in hindsight. Riff, who had been silent, spoke up. The oracle told me I would need to make a choice too. It did not specify what I would be choosing between. I spent years trying to understand what that meant. It was only when it came to pass that it finally made sense. She looked at Yenna with the sympathy of someone who has wrestled with fate. Do not let the prophecy make you reckless. It is a map, not an order. On the 7th day, they travelled back to the capital together, Yenna, Marius, and Antti, in the carriage. Yenna told the men about the prophecy she had shared with the women. Marius looked at her with new interest. He told her his own, about the Eastern Queen hidden and the warning to stand, not run, about how Reifer had been exactly that, though he had not known it at the time. Reiner's, about the wild dragon she would need to catch and teach. Severin, who had been more beast than man when they found him, and was now the steadiest thing in her life. Riffs, which had been about silence and space and becoming the ground others stood on, about choices handed to people who had not asked for the duty. The trick, Marius said, is not to let the prophecy turn you into a reckless fool. It tells you what might happen, not what you should do. You still have to choose. Then Antti, who had been listening with the quiet attention of someone weighing whether to speak, asked something unexpected. What did this oracle look like? They described her, small, ageless, with eyes that seemed older than stone and hair that had given up on cooperation. A woman who spoke plain truth and left without ceremony. Auntie nodded slowly. I met her. Yenna and Marius both turned to stare. When? Marius demanded. I was 13, Auntie said, alone in the forest trying to catch a horse that had bolted. I was furious at the horse, at my grandmother for making me do it myself, at my father for leaving me to be raised by someone else. At everything, really. He smiled, faint and crooked. She stepped out from behind a tree as if she had been waiting, told me she had a message. What did she say? Yenna asked. Auntie's smile faded. She said, what you least want in the world will find you anyway, either by choice of another or by blood. Do not shy from it when it comes the first time. For the second time, the cost is higher. The carriage went quiet. I thought she meant the horse, Auntie admitted. I was very young and very stupid. And now? Marius asked. Auntie looked out the window at the northern landscape rolling past, roads that led to a capital where a trial waited for a crown he did not want. Now, he said, I think she meant this. Marius laughed, not cruelly, but with the sympathy of someone who has wrestled with fate and come out bruised but wiser. We all have them, he said. Prophecies, I mean. The oracle seems to collect us. Mine has already run its course, he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the future and the past at once. I stood instead of running. I found my queen. The prophecy is done, and I am still myself. He looked at Yenna and Auntie with something that might have been encouragement, or might have been warning. But you two still labour under yours. Crown and sky, Yenna murmured. What you least want, Auntie said. Marius leaned back against the seat. The second trial begins tomorrow. Whatever it is, remember, the prophecy is not an order. It is a map. You still choose the path. And if we choose wrong? Yenna asked. Then you choose again, Marius said simply. That is what living is. The carriage rolled on through the winter afternoon, carrying 3 people marked by prophecy toward a trial that would test political acumen, while behind them at Reda House, 2 dragons whispered about blue wings and difficult choices, and a small girl taught a grieving boy that joy and sorrow could be held in the same hands if you were brave enough not to let go. Chapter 8. The Trial of Politics. The second trial was announced in the Great Hall with considerably less ceremony than the first. Politics, said the head of the Merchants' Guild, with the satisfaction of someone who has designed a test that cannot be cheated. The playground is the court. The goal is to win its support. At the end of 2 weeks, the one with the least backing will be eliminated. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The court was already watching. Nobles were already choosing sides. The trial had begun the moment she stopped speaking. Marius decided, in the space between one breath and the next, that this was his stop. He could play this game. He had played it in his own court, had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of favour and influence, had mastered the art of making allies without owing debts. He was good at it, not because he enjoyed it, but because competence is a habit that does not distinguish between pleasant tasks and tedious ones. But he did not want to. He had won this game once, that had been enough. Instead, he played for both sides in turn, carefully balancing Auntie and Yenna like weights on a scale. He supported Yenna's proposals in council when they were practical. He defended Auntie's judgments when they were fair. He argued against both when they were wrong, and praised both when they were right. He found it, to his surprise, rather fun. The court did not know what to make of him. A king who already wore a crown, competing for another he clearly did not want, supporting his opponents with the same energy he might have used to defeat them. It was baffling. It was honest. It was, several nobles muttered, extremely irritating. At the end of the first week, the tally was taken informally in corners and over wine. Auntie had the soldiers and the commons. Yenna had the merchants and the practical-minded. Marius had everyone's respect and no one's vote. At the end of the second week, it was official. Marius bowed out of the trial with the same calm he had brought to it, stepped down from the dais, and told his grandfather, "I am satisfied. Either of them will do well." The old king smiled. "You were never here to win." "No," Marius agreed. "I was here to make sure the right person did." Again they invited Yenna to Reda House, now for the 2 weeks until the final trial. And again, she went. The place had started to feel like home. As she stepped out of the carriage, she immediately noticed something new. A man stood behind a tall, black-haired figure next to Raina. The tall man wore a silver collar, elegant, deliberate, the kind of thing that was clearly a choice. But the one behind him wore an old, worn leather collar, like a dog. The man stood hunched and withdrawn, making himself small in a way that had nothing to do with his actual size and everything to do with the weight he carried. Yenna got immediately, instinctively angry. "Raina," she said, her voice tight. "Why is that man collared and standing like a beaten dog?" Raina sighed. It was not the sigh of someone avoiding a question, but of someone who has tried to answer it for years and failed. "Go try to take it away from him," she said. Yenna stepped forward, reaching for the collar. The man immediately shrank back, his hands flying up, not to stop her, but to protect the leather at his throat. "Mistress, do not," he begged, his voice breaking. "Please." Yenna stopped. Raina sighed again. "I have offered him safety for 5 years now, but he is not improving in my care." There was mischief in her eyes then, and something sharper, sadness, perhaps, or resignation. "Rishan," she said, addressing the man, "I am not keeping you any more. You belong to her now." The man, Rishan, went absolutely still. Then he stepped out from behind Severin, who had been standing patient and steady as a wall, and bowed to Yenna. "New mistress?" he whispered, shaking. Yenna's anger sobered into something more complicated. "Will you tell me your story?" she asked, her voice gentler now. "If mistress commands," was his automatic answer. Raina considered it prudent to add one more thing. "Rishan is a pale blue dragon. Do not ask him to be large in the house to prove it. The house would suffer needlessly." And so they went inside. At dinner that evening, Yenna apologized to Raina. "I spent the entire afternoon trying to get him to relinquish the collar," she said quietly. "I failed." Raina nodded, unsurprised. "It took me a winter to convince Severin to replace his leather collar with silver. Even now he will never go without it." She looked at the black-haired man beside her, Severin, who met her gaze with the steady calm of someone who knows himself and is not ashamed. "The blue is different," Raina continued. "His dragon he can accept. It is the man he is that he cannot accept. And teaching him to value himself is beyond my ability." She looked at Yenna then, eyes serious. "Perhaps it is not beyond yours." Yenna found him that night sleeping behind her door like a dog guarding a threshold. She brought him into the room, onto the hearth rug at first with the two hounds who had decided they were hers. Then, after a day, onto the couch when he got used to her a bit more and could be persuaded. She braided his hair, which had been left tangled and uncared for. She found good clothes for him, simple, well-made things that fit properly. He tried to argue, but her touch did things to him that made him want to stand taller, and the arguments died in his throat. "Stand," she told him. "Sit by my side. Make me proud." And he tried. For her. She, in return, asked for his support in little ways, handing her things, fetching her water, small domestic things. She saw it then, the spark that lit when she let him care for her. Not in servitude, but as support. She had never allowed herself to lean on anyone, had built her life on the principle that strength meant standing alone. Now, for his sake, she leaned and found it comforting to both. She asked for his story again, and in pieces it came. He had been young once and proud, a dragon who thought the world existed to serve him because that was exactly what his proud parents had demanded. But centuries passed, and his colour stayed grey. He sought his purpose in power and command, but could never find it. He left his life and his parents in shame and flew to the far isles of the West. He lived there, alone, keeping away from both humans and dragons alike for almost 300 years, still grey and thoroughly ashamed of it. Then, one day, he landed by a river and helped a sad, pregnant girl climb up a bank she was struggling with. The feeling that flooded him was so good, so right, that his colour came, pale blue, the colour of service, of carrying, of being the strength others leaned on. The joy dissolved to shame, for this was not what he had been raised for. He had been raised to glory and command. He flew down to a lake to look at his colour, to understand what it meant. He ended up looking into the wide, open, dead eyes of the girl he had just helped. And then, the water spirit she had given her body and her life to had claimed him too. He did not remember much from the time serving the Lady of the Lake. It felt like a dream, a nightmare of cold water and colder commands, of beatings and torture and the slow, grinding certainty that he was worthless. He felt deserving of it, of all of it. "I still feel worthless," he whispered. Yenna stopped him with a touch. "You are not worthless," she said. "Even Marius fell prey to the lady. Even he could not escape her on his own. It was not your weakness. It was her power." Rishan cried then, the first honest tears he had allowed himself in years. She wiped them away and held him. That night he cried in his sleep on the couch. Yenna could not help it. She brought him to her bed and held him, the way one holds something broken that needs mending. He quieted at first, fell asleep with the kind of trust that comes from exhaustion and the absence of fear. Then, as dawn started to colour the sky, he awoke and really looked at Yenna for the first time. She was sleeping. Her usually serious face was relaxed and calm. His hand rose of his own accord to caress it with tenderness, and then he felt it, clear and hot and unmistakable. The mate bond awakening fully at the touch. With a jolt of panic, he tore himself from her arms, waking her, and leapt out the window. He flew into the night with a strangled, anguished cry, leaving her confused and alone. As the day was reaching for noon, she found him in the garden, standing with the defeated patience of someone who expects punishment. "Tell me the truth of what happened," she commanded. The command settled over him like a chain, and he could not disobey. "Mistress is my mate," he said, the words dragged out like splinters. "I will accept the rejection. I will serve Mistress anyway, as long as Mistress wants. But please," his voice broke, "please never give me away. I cannot live without Mistress anymore." He was so certain there would be a rejection. He wished it to be mercifully quick. He did not get what he wished for. Yenna sent him to eat and then sleep, and he obeyed. She sought out Alaris because he was the only one with any experience with this sort of thing, of being a dragon's mate. She found him in the stable as usual, doing work that did not need doing because it gave his hands something to hold. "I need advice," she said. Alaris looked up, saw her face, and set down the bridle he had been oiling. "Sit." She told him everything. Alaris listened without interrupting. Then he told her his own story, the dragon who had been his mate, the choice he had made on a square, the alternate future the oracle had shown him where he chose wrong. "One cannot be both king and a dragon's mate," he said quietly. "Dragons and their mates cannot rule human kingdoms or fight human wars. The covenant forbids it, and even if it did not, the bond makes it difficult. You will always choose them over the crown. Always." He paused, his hands still. "And," he whispered, "not choosing your heart has a terrible cost. Rishon will break. He will not survive it." He looked at her then, green eyes steady and sad. "And you will not go unchanged either. It is not as bad as it was for Elisa and me. You have not been that foolish yet. But the magic is already at work. Every day that you leave it hanging, it will get stronger and more painful to sever." Yenna left, her head and heart full of thoughts that tangled like thread pulled wrong. Crown and sky, heart and power, the choice the oracle had promised. It had found her.